A ceasefire can be announced, and the killing can keep going. A parliament can claim it's restoring order, and the real job can be silencing dissent. So when today's headlines say this region is calming down, the more useful question is, calming down for whom? Today's reports connect in a way the coverage barely admits out loud. In Lebanon, a so-called ceasefire is looking less like peace and more like a demand for one side to stand down while the other keeps the right to strike. In Gaza, the war is still producing fresh deaths, even as negotiators fly to Cairo and officials talk as if a diplomatic process is underway. And in Britain, a story about two media figures being blocked from entering the country opens a much bigger window into donor money, party discipline, and how criticism of Israel gets policed before it even reaches the public. We're going to line up the reporting, compare the different angles, and pull out what mainstream coverage keeps sanding down. If you're getting value from this breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Start with Lebanon, because this is where the language is doing the heavy lifting. The agreement being sold as a ceasefire was reportedly signed by the US, Israel, and Lebanon, but not with Hezbollah meaningfully at the table. That alone tells you plenty. A real ceasefire is supposed to stop the shooting. This one, at least on paper, demands Hezbollah withdraw from south of the Litani River, stop firing, and hand over ground control to the Lebanese armed forces in pilot zones, while giving Israel no clear obligation to fully leave or stop its own strikes. That is not a peace deal in the normal sense. It is a one-sided restructuring of the battlefield. Hezbollah's response was blunt. It called the arrangement illusory and said it amounted to a roadmap for erasing part of Lebanon and subordinating the rest. Israeli officials, for their part, have been even less interested in pretending. The IDF chief said there is no ceasefire for Israeli forces in Lebanon. Israel's defense minister said the military still has freedom to strike Beirut if it decides Hezbollah has crossed the line. So on one side you have a deal being marketed as stabilization, and on the other side you have the army involved, saying it can keep attacking whenever it wants. That's the part a lot of headlines bury. The agreement doesn't end the war, it manages the optics of the war. And the civilian record tells the same story. Israeli strikes kept hitting Lebanon after the agreement, including the Bekaa Valley, Tyre, Nabatea, and a motorcycle in Marub. A UN peacekeeper was killed, paramedics were killed, an ambulance was hit, a hospital area in Tyre was struck again, and residents were told to evacuate parts of the south even though bridges had already been destroyed, making those orders close to impossible to carry out in practice. That's not an accidental detail. It turns evacuation into theater when the routes out have been cut. It also matters that the people being killed most often in these reports are not fighters. They're medics, rescue workers, civilians, and people trying to move through a landscape already carved up by bombs and forced displacement. When the coverage centers only the diplomatic text, it can make all of that sound secondary. It isn't secondary. It's the actual mechanism of control. And then there's Iran, which keeps pushing back on the same basic point. If attacks continue on Lebanon, then the idea that the war is somehow over is fiction. Iranian officials have said repeatedly that any genuine ceasefire has to apply across all fronts. They've also gone further, warning that U.S. bases and regional assets become legitimate targets when Washington gives Israel room to keep hitting Lebanese territory and keeps the blockade pressure on Iranian shipping. That's the missing context in the restraint narrative. Officials keep using words like calm, de-escalation, and stabilization, but the underlying strategy is still coercion. Even the talk of sanctions relief and frozen Iranian assets is framed as a reward system after compliance, not a serious diplomatic bargain between equals. Trump is floating the idea that a deal is close while also warning he can blow the hell out of Iran if things don't go his way. That is not diplomacy in any clean sense. It is pressure paired with a handshake for the cameras. The bottom line is simple. If one side can keep bombing, keep occupying, and keep setting the terms, then the word ceasefire becomes less a description of reality and more a branding exercise. Now shift to Gaza, because the reporting there exposes the same pattern in an even harsher form. The headlines say ceasefire talks continue, but on the ground, Israeli attacks never really stopped behaving like war. One report says at least 9 Palestinians were killed in a 24-hour span. Another says at least 13 were killed since dawn as the Egyptian talks restarted. Elsewhere, a grandfather described his daughter, son-in-law, and grandchildren burned alive in a strike that set their apartment on fire. He said the idea that the war is over is a trick. That line should stick with people because it cuts through all the polished language. For the people living through it, this is not a finished conflict. It's a rolling catastrophe with new paperwork. What mainstream coverage often does here is isolate the diplomacy from the destruction. It covers the Cairo meetings, the Hamas delegation, the mediators, the proposal language, and then it treats the bombardment like background noise. But the bombardment is the point of leverage. It's the pressure that forces one side to negotiate under fire, while the other side keeps changing facts on the ground. And those facts are getting uglier by the day. Reports say Israel is now controlling about 64% of Gaza, with plans to push towards 70%. That means the ceasefire framework is being used alongside an active territorial seizure. So when officials talk about the next phase, what they often mean is disarmament for Palestinians first, withdrawal maybe later, and rebuilding only after the map has been redrawn in Israel's favor. That's why the Gaza talks in Cairo matter, but not in the sentimental way the headlines sometimes frame them. Hamas is reportedly insisting that Israel's attacks stop before any next phase can move forward. Palestinian factions are trying to coordinate a unified position. The reason is obvious. Nobody serious wants to negotiate a future while the present is still being demolished. The casualty numbers also keep growing under the public's radar. One rights group called May the deadliest month of 2026 so far in Gaza. Thousands are still missing beneath rubble. More than 70,000 Palestinians have been reported killed since the assault began, and even that number is likely too low because so many bodies were never recovered. Those are not statistics that belong in a footnote. They are the central fact of the story. And then there's the infrastructure of control beyond the airstrikes. A detained Gaza doctor has been moved into solitary confinement. Healthcare workers are still being held. Aid routes are tightly controlled. In one separate but related story, Gaza flotilla volunteers were detained in Libya and described their holding site as a black site, cut off from lawyers and medical care. That's part of the same moral universe. When people try to challenge the blockade or document the violence, they get treated like a security problem. So when a headline says ceasefire talks, ask a different question. Ceasefire for whom and at what price? If the answer still includes constant bombing, forced displacement, detention, and territorial expansion, then the word itself is being abused. The British story is different on the surface, but it rhymes with the war coverage in a way that's hard to ignore. Hassan Piker and Cenk Uygur were blocked from entering the UK, reportedly because of their criticism of Israel. That alone is a major speech issue. But the deeper reporting says the problem isn't just one border decision, it's a political ecosystem. According to the article, Keir Starmer's rise inside Labour was helped by a secretive project built around Labour Together, a think tank that received large sums for wealthy donors, some of them openly tied to pro-Israel politics. The piece argues that this network helped marginalize the left wing of the party, smother internal debate, and promote a leadership line that was presented as unity, but functioned more like a purge. That's the part mainstream coverage tends to flatten. It becomes party modernization or discipline, when what's being described is a coordinated donor-backed operation to reshape the party's ideological boundaries. The article points to Morgan McSweeney as a central figure, with internal plans to undermine Corbyn, groom a successor, and wrap the whole thing in a public image of neutrality. Meanwhile, money from figures like Trevor Chin and Martin Taylor flowed in, donations went unreported properly for a period, and the machinery kept running. Now, notice what happened next. The same political culture that treated anti-war voices as a problem also produced the environment where criticism of Israel can be framed as borderline unacceptable. Shabana Mahmood, who was linked in the piece to the Labour Together orbit, is now the Home Secretary involved in the ban. David Taylor, another MP pushing for the ban, was backed by the same network. So the article's argument is not just that a couple of activists were blocked. It's that an entire factional project funded and shielded from scrutiny helped normalize the idea that criticism of Israel sits outside the acceptable range of speech. That matters because when governments start treating foreign policy criticism as a security issue, the public loses the ability to discuss the policy itself. You can disagree with someone's style, their rhetoric, or their platform, but once criticism gets rebranded as a threat, the debate stops being about evidence and starts being about permission. The reporting also says journalists who investigated this network were smeared, reported to UK cybersecurity officials, and subjected to wild accusations that never panned out. That should set off alarms. Whenever a political machine tries to launder influence through anti-extremism language, it usually means the real goal is protecting power, not protecting the public. So the ban on Piker and Uygur isn't just about two personalities. It's a snapshot of how donor influence, party discipline, and speech policing can work together to narrow the conversation before it even starts. Put all of this together, and a wider pattern appears. Washington says it wants restraint, but it keeps the pressure tools in place. Congress votes on war powers resolutions, but the broader military integration with Israel keeps moving forward. Officials talk about diplomacy, while naval blockades, sanctions, tanker strikes, and air raids keep the conflict alive in different forms. Even the countries around the region are reacting as if this is no ordinary ceasefire. Gulf states are worried about shipping lanes and energy shocks. Oman, Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, all of them are being dragged into a war they did not start, while trying to manage the fallout from someone else's escalation. That's why fertilizer prices, diesel prices, and oil loading terminals show up in these stories. The war is not just bombing cities, it is rearranging the cost of everything. And then there's Ukraine, where a major drone barrage hit St. Petersburg and Moscow as the global war environment keeps widening. That's not a separate universe. It's another reminder that once states accept endless military pressure as normal, the borders between local conflict and global instability get thinner fast. The coverage wants these to feel like separate episodes. They aren't. They're all part of a system that rewards force, disguises coercion as negotiation, and tells the public to call it stability, while the damage accumulates in plain sight. The first big takeaway is that a ceasefire is not really a ceasefire if one side keeps the right to strike, occupy, and redraw territory. Second, Gaza is still being treated as a pressure chamber, not a place where civilians have any real protection. Third, the UK ban story shows how donor networks and speech policing can quietly narrow the public debate long before any official announcement does. And finally, the mainstream version of these stories keeps missing the same thing: the policy is the violence. And the headlines often arrive after the fact to make it sound cleaner than it is. If this breakdown helped connect the dots, like the video, subscribe to Daily News, and drop a comment with the story you think is getting the most important part left out. Tomorrow's update gets into what happens next if the Lebanon arrangement collapses and whether the Gaza talks are actually moving anywhere at all.